5 parasites, 5 invisible enemies that turned the Vietnam jungle into a biological nightmare for American soldiers. Veterans requested this video because what they faced in the mud and water of Southeast Asia doesn't appear in any combat medal citation. This is raw, unfiltered reality, not the sanitized history of firefights and body counts. Most people know about Agent Orange and punji stakes, but the microscopic horrors that invaded soldiers' bodies from the inside, that's a different kind of warfare entirely. What separates you from those who understand Vietnam is this. You're about to hear what 2.7 million American soldiers faced beyond bullets. These weren't complications. These were weapons the jungle deployed with ruthless efficiency. What you're about to hear won't be comfortable, but it's what actually happened in rice paddies, triple canopy jungle, and forward operating bases across Vietnam. Let's get into it. The Pentagon spent $168 billion on the Vietnam War, but couldn't spend its way out of parasitic infection. Declassified Army medical reports from 1968 1972 reveal that non-combat casualties from parasitic diseases exceeded combat casualties in certain units by ratios as high as 3:1. This isn't discussed because it doesn't fit the narrative of technological superiority versus guerrilla tactics, but ask any grunt who humped through the Mekong Delta or the Central Highlands, and they'll tell you the enemy you couldn't see, couldn't shoot, and couldn't escape was often worse than the NVA. These 5 parasites represent evolutionary perfection in hostile environments. Organisms that had 10,000 years to adapt to Southeast Asian conditions, meeting young Americans whose bodies had zero biological preparation. Military psychiatric studies show these infections created psychological trauma distinct from combat stress, a sense of bodily invasion and helplessness that persists in veteran health records today. The cruelest irony of schistosomiasis in Vietnam was this. The very water soldiers depended on for survival, for cooling down, for cleaning weapons, for washing the blood and mud off after firefights, contained parasites specifically evolved to penetrate human skin in under 10 minutes. Veterans called it rice paddy fever, but that nickname doesn't capture what was actually happening inside their bodies. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear that haunted every river crossing, every monsoon downpour that flooded foxholes, every moment of contact with Vietnamese water. Schistosoma japonicum and Schistosoma mekongi larvae, Cercariae, floated in virtually every freshwater source in Vietnam's rural areas. According to military medical records, these microscopic parasites could detect human skin through chemical signatures, actively swimming toward exposed flesh. The penetration took 5 pounds, 5 minutes of water contact. One Marine rifleman from 1st Battalion, 5th Marines described in documented oral histories, "You'd be crossing a paddy under fire, waist deep in that warm water, and you couldn't think about what was getting into you." But later in the hospital, they told me I had hundreds of these things in my bloodstream. The larvae burrowed through intact skin without wounds, releasing enzymes that dissolve tissue at the cellular level. Within 48 hours, they reached the bloodstream. Within 2 weeks, they matured into adult flukes, 14 millimeters long, residing in blood vessels around the intestines and liver, laying up to 3,000 eggs per day. What made schistosomiasis particularly devastating was its progression. Initial infections caused Katayama fever, sudden spikes to 104-degree temperatures, violent chills, bloody diarrhea, but the real damage was cumulative. Army medical reports from the 25th Infantry Division documented soldiers with egg counts exceeding 500 per gram of feces after multiple patrols through infected areas. Each egg represented an immune response, the body attacking itself. The eggs lodged in liver tissue, creating granulomas, scarring that reduced liver function by measurable percentages. One tunnel rat from Kuchi recalled, 6 months in country, I couldn't keep food down, lost 40 pounds. They medevaced me to Saigon, and the doc said my liver looked like someone had taken a shotgun to it from the inside. The standard treatment, antimony compounds, caused its own toxicity, cardiac arrhythmias, severe nausea. Soldiers faced a choice between parasitic destruction and chemical poisoning. Veterans consistently describe schistosomiasis as violating their sense of bodily autonomy in ways combat didn't. You could learn to handle incoming fire. You couldn't control what entered your bloodstream through your skin. The sensory experience was insidious, no pain during penetration, just later the realization that organisms were reproducing inside you, stealing resources, destroying organs. A Navy corpsman stationed with 3rd Marine Division stated in Walter Reed interviews, the guys who got shot, they understood that. But the guys with blood flukes, they felt contaminated, like the jungle had gotten inside them and they'd never get it out. The smell of infected blood and stool, the sight of distended abdomens from liver damage, the sound of men vomiting up blood, these created specific trauma markers still present in VA medical records. The fear wasn't of dying in combat, it was of being slowly consumed from within. But the second parasite went even deeper into the body's most sensitive systems. Lymphatic filariasis represented biological warfare at its most grotesque, a mosquito-borne parasite that didn't just infect, it disfigured. The bitter irony was that soldiers took their anti-malarial pills religiously, but those drugs did nothing against Wuchereria, Bancrofti, and Brugia malayi, the parasitic worms that turned lymphatic systems into breeding grounds. Military medical reports classified this as a low-priority threat until forward operating bases in rural areas started reporting cases where soldiers' body parts swelled to inhuman proportions. Let's break down why this became a terror that haunted soldiers long after they left Vietnam. Mosquitoes, primarily Culex and Aedes species that swarmed every fire base perimeter at dusk, injected third-stage larvae during blood meals. These larvae, 0.2 millimeters long, migrated to lymph nodes and vessels within 72 hours. According to declassified 1st Cavalry Division medical logs, a single infected mosquito bite could introduce 1050 larvae. Over 6 months, these matured into adult worms, 10 centimeters long, living in lymphatic vessels for up to 7 years. An artillery specialist from Fire Support Base Ripcord described in VA interviews they found 3 adult worms in my groin lymph nodes during surgery in 1971. The doctor said they'd been there since '69, just reproducing, blocking everything. The adults released millions of microfilariae into the bloodstream, microscopic offspring that circulated primarily at night, perfectly timed with mosquito feeding patterns. The parasite had evolved to use human hosts as breeding reservoirs. The visible horror of filariasis was lymphedema, lymphatic fluid accumulation that caused tissue swelling measured in kilograms. Army dermatology reports from the 101st Airborne documented soldiers whose scrotal sacs swelled to 30 pounds, whose legs expanded to twice normal diameter, whose arms became immobilized by fluid retention. The blockage of lymph vessels caused by dead worms and immune responses created permanent damage. One infantry sergeant from the American Division recalled, "My left leg started swelling in '68. By '72, back in the States, it was 3 times the size of my right. I couldn't wear normal pants. Couldn't run. The VA said the scarring in my lymph vessels was irreversible. The condition? Elephantiasis, destroyed military careers and civilian lives. The thick, hardened skin, the weeping sores from stretched tissue, the inability to fit into standard clothing or footwear, these created social isolation that VA psychiatric records linked to depression and suicide risk elevation. Veterans consistently described lymphatic filariasis as violating their most intimate spaces. The preferential settling of worms in genital lymphatics meant soldiers experienced swelling in testicles, penis, scrotum, areas they couldn't discuss openly in military culture. The psychological impact went beyond physical disfigurement. A Marine corporal from Quezon stated in medical documentation, "You can't explain to people back home that you got a disease in Vietnam that made your balls swell up like grapefruits. They looked at you like you'd caught something shameful, something sexual. But it was mosquitoes. Just mosquitoes at night while you're trying to sleep on watch." The sound of mosquitoes became associated with this specific dread. The sight of swelling in showers, the touch of distended tissue, the smell of lymphatic fluid leaking through skin, these sensory markers created trauma distinct from combat. The fear was of becoming unrecognizable, of carrying physical evidence of Vietnam that couldn't be hidden or explained. But the third parasite attacked the body's foundation, the blood itself. The perverse reality of hookworm infection in Vietnam was that soldiers were infected through their feet. The same boots-on-ground mentality celebrated in military culture became a vector for parasites that could drain a pint of blood per month from a single infected soldier. Necator americanus, an Ancylostoma duodenale larvae, lived in Vietnamese soil, wading in feces-contaminated dirt around villages, latrines, and anywhere humans had walked. Declassified Army medical surveys from 1969 show infection rates in certain infantry units reached 40%, with soldiers losing measurable blood volume without a single bullet fired. Let's break down why this became a chronic catastrophe that the military couldn't simply medicate away. Hookworm larvae, microscopic third-stage filariform forms, lived in topsoil and mud for weeks, actively hunting for exposed skin. Military reports noted that despite boot regulations, soldiers in humid jungle conditions often went barefoot in base camps, walked through streams in sandals, or had boot deterioration that exposed feet to soil. Penetration took 60 minutes of contact. One Army medic from the 4th Infantry Division described in documented interviews, guys would come in with these red, itchy tracks on their feet and ankles. Ground itch, we called it. That was the larvae burrowing in. Within days, they'd be coughing from the larvae migrating through their lungs. Within weeks, they'd be anemic. The larvae traveled through bloodstream to lungs, were coughed up and swallowed, then matured in the small intestine. Adult hookworms, 1013 millimeters long, attached to intestinal walls using cutting plates and teeth, then began feeding on blood, 0.2 milliliters per worm per day. What military doctors underestimated was the cumulative effect of multiple worm infections. After-action medical reports from the 173rd Airborne Brigade documented soldiers harboring 500 adult hookworms simultaneously after extended field operations. At peak infection, this represented 100 milliliters of blood lost daily, enough to cause clinical anemia within weeks. The worms injected anticoagulants to keep blood flowing, meaning attachment sites continued bleeding even after worms detached to feed elsewhere. One rifle platoon leader recalled, "I was passing Black Terry Stool, Milena, the doc called it, digested blood. My hemoglobin dropped to 7 grams per deciliter. They said normal is 1.418. I could barely hump my ruck 100 meters without getting winded. The treatment mebendazole killed worms but didn't immediately restore blood volume. Soldiers required iron supplementation, blood transfusions in severe cases, and weeks of recovery time that removed them from combat effectiveness. Veterans consistently describe hookworm anemia as creating a terrifying disconnect between mental will and physical capability. The crushing fatigue, the inability to maintain combat readiness, the weakness that could get entire fire teams killed. These psychological burdens exceeded the physical disease. A door gunner from the 1st Aviation Brigade stated in Walter Reed case studies, "You're supposed to be covering your guys, staying alert on watch, reacting fast under fire, but I was so weak from blood loss that I'd fall asleep on guard duty. Not because I was lazy, because these things inside me were literally drinking my energy away." The sight of pale skin in mirrors, the sound of labored breathing during simple tasks, the touch of cold extremities from poor circulation, the taste of iron deficiency, these sensory experiences created a sense of bodily betrayal. The fear wasn't of enemies you could fight, it was of your own body failing you when your brothers needed you most. But the 4th parasite created devastation in the digestive tract itself. The ultimate nightmare of Entamoeba histolytica was that it turned the most basic human need, eating and drinking, into Russian roulette. This single-celled parasite caused amoebic dysentery, transforming intestinal tissue into ulcerated battlegrounds and making soldiers fear food and water as much as enemy fire. Military medical records show that during peak monsoon seasons, 1.5% of soldiers in certain areas of operation contracted E. histolytica, with mortality rates reaching 2–3% in severe cases, higher than many combat engagements. The bitter irony was that soldiers could survive firefights only to die from contaminated water they drank to stay alive. Let's break down why this became one of the most dreaded parasitic infections in Vietnam. E. histolytica spread through fecal-oral transmission, cysts in contaminated water, unwashed hands, local food prepared in unsanitary conditions. According to Army preventive medicine reports, standard water purification tablets were effective against bacteria, but less reliable against protozoan cysts. A single cyst, 10.15 micrometers in diameter, could survive in water sources for weeks. One supply sergeant from Long Binh recalled, "We'd fill our canteens from supposedly purified water buffalo trailers, but guys were still getting sick." Turns out the local Vietnamese workers were washing the trailers with contaminated river water. Once ingested, cysts released trophozoites, the active feeding form, in the intestines. These 2040 micrometer organisms invaded intestinal wall tissue using enzymes and proteins that literally dissolved cells, creating flask-shaped ulcers that penetrated through mucosa into deeper layers. The hemorrhagic devastation. What made amoebic dysentery particularly terrifying was its violence. The ulcers bled, producing the characteristic bloody flux, diarrhea with blood, mucus, and tissue fragments. Declassified hospital records from the 24th Evacuation Hospital documented soldiers passing 1.020 bloody stools per day, losing liters of fluid, becoming dehydrated to the point of renal failure within 2 hours. In severe cases, the amoeba breached the intestinal wall entirely, spreading to liver through portal blood vessels, amoeba liver abscesses, pockets of destroyed liver tissue filled with pus and dead amoeba. Could reach 10. 15 centimeters in diameter. A platoon medic from the 9th Infantry Division described in documented testimony, "I watched a 19-year-old kid go from healthy to dead in 5 days. The dysentery wouldn't stop. His liver swelled so much you could see it distending his abdomen. When it finally ruptured, there was nothing we could do. The mortality came from perforation, peritonitis, septic shock, the contamination paranoia." Veterans consistently describe E. histolytica as creating a psychological prison around basic survival needs. Every drink of water, every meal, every moment of poor hygiene became a potential infection vector. The crushing anxiety of never knowing if you were ingesting the parasite created hypervigilance around food and water that persisted for decades. One reconnaissance Marine stated in VA psychiatric evaluations, "I still can't drink tap water without boiling it first. I'm 75 years old, living in America, but my brain is still in Vietnam worrying about cysts in the water. I smell anything off in food, I can't eat it. The sound of my own stomach growling triggers me back to that dysentery, where I thought my guts were tearing themselves apart. The sensory experience, the sight of blood in toilet water, the smell of infected stool, the feeling of intestinal cramping so severe it doubled men over, the taste of metallic blood, these created trauma markers distinct from combat. The fear was of losing control of your own body in the most humiliating, painful way possible. But the fifth parasite was perhaps the most insidious, one that attacked the liver with surgical precision. 5. Liver flukes. The silent organ destroyers, the final biological nightmare was Clonorchus sinensis and Opisthochus viverini, liver flukes that soldiers ingested through undercooked fish, a dietary staple in Vietnamese culture that soldiers encountered during village operations, medcap missions, or simple hunger in the field. Military parasitology reports show these flatworms could live in human bile ducts for 2030 years, causing chronic inflammation that led to bile duct cancer decades after Vietnam. The perverse irony was that these infections were often asymptomatic initially. Soldiers carried them home, unknowing, until VA hospitals in the 1980s and 90s started seeing cholangiocarcinoma clusters in Vietnam veterans. Let's break down why this became a time-delayed catastrophe. Liver fluke metacercarii, larval cysts, lived in freshwater fish muscle tissue, particularly carp, endemic to Vietnamese rivers and rice paddies. Standard military rations were often supplemented by local food sources, especially in isolated Special Forces camps or during extended patrols. According to declassified Special Forces medical logs, soldiers who ate with local Vietnamese populations or attempted to fish for fresh protein were at highest risk. One Green Beret advisor in the Mekong Delta described in oral histories, "We'd eat fish the Vietnamese prepared, trying to build rapport. Nobody told us about liver flukes. The fish looked cooked, tasted fine, but those parasites survive temperatures up to 60 degrees Celsius. Once ingested, the larvae existed in the duodenum, migrated through the ampulla of Vater into bile ducts, and matured over 4 weeks into adult flukes, 10.25 millimeters long. Adult liver flukes attached to bile duct walls using oral suckers, feeding on epithelial cells and blood. The mechanical irritation and toxic metabolites they released caused chronic cholangitis, bile duct inflammation. Military follow-up studies tracking Vietnam veterans into the 1990s found that chronic fluke infections caused bile duct dilation, fibrosis, stone formation, and eventually, in 5.10% of chronic cases, cholangiocarcinoma, bile duct cancer with 5-year survival rates below 30%. A reconnaissance team leader from SOG recalled, "I had right upper quadrant pain for 30 years after Vietnam. Doctors thought it was gallstones." In 1998, they finally did the right tests, found liver flukes and precancerous changes. Had to remove part of my liver. They said if I'd known in '69, they could have just given me praziquantel. The tragedy was preventability. The infection was treatable, but diagnosis required specific stool tests rarely performed in the field. Veterans consistently described liver flukes as the betrayal that kept giving. Unlike parasites with immediate symptoms, liver flukes were silent killers, accumulating damage over decades without clear warning signs. The psychological impact came later. The realization that something from Vietnam was still inside you, still destroying tissue, potentially cancerous. A Riverine 4 sailor stated in Agent Orange litigation testimony, "In 2003 they told me I had bile duct cancer from liver flukes I got in '68. 35 years later, Vietnam was still killing me. I'd survived combat, survived coming home, raised kids, retired, and then this parasite I didn't even know I had sentenced me to death." The smell of hospitals during cancer treatment, the sight of jaundiced skin from bile duct obstruction, the touch of surgical scars, the sound of oncologists discussing terminal prognosis, these created a specific grief. The fear was retrospective, that you'd carried your own destruction inside you for decades, that Vietnam had planted a biological time bomb that finally detonated when you thought you were safe. What connects all 5 parasites is this fundamental truth. Vietnam was a war fought on 2 fronts simultaneously, and American soldiers were catastrophically unprepared for the biological front. Unlike conventional warfare where enemies could be identified, targeted, and destroyed, these parasites were invisible, inescapable, and embedded in the very environment soldiers operated in. You couldn't bomb schistosomes. You couldn't call artillery on hookworms. You couldn't evacuate from mosquitoes carrying filariasis. The water you needed to survive infected you. The ground you walked on infected you. The food you ate to maintain strength infected you. The air thick with mosquitoes infected you. This created a psychological state unique in American military history. Constant awareness that your own body was a battlefield you were losing. Decades of studies on Vietnam veterans reveal that parasitic infections created distinct PTSD markers separate from combat trauma. Military psychiatric research shows that survivors of chronic parasitic disease report higher rates of somatic symptom disorders, persistent focus on bodily sensations, health anxiety, hypervigilance around contamination. The VA estimates that 1520% of Vietnam veterans experience significant parasitic infections during service, with thousands still carrying medical consequences today. Liver fluke-related bile duct cancers, lymphatic damage from filariasis, chronic anemia from hookworm scarring, liver fibrosis from schistosomiasis. These aren't historical footnotes. These are active medical cases in VA hospitals right now in 2024 from a war that ended 49 years ago. These weren't just soldiers fighting an unpopular war in impossible conditions. They were young men, average age 19, sent into a biological environment their bodies had never encountered, with inadequate medical preparation, facing organisms that had evolved over millennia to exploit human hosts. Over 58,000 American soldiers died in combat in Vietnam. Millions more came home carrying parasites that would damage their bodies, destroy their organs, and create suffering that no Purple Heart recognizes. The invisible wounds of Vietnam weren't all psychological. Many were microscopic, wriggling, reproducing inside blood vessels and intestines and bile ducts. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this and you experienced any of these parasitic infections, your story matters. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your testimony helps younger generations understand the full cost of that war. If this video gave you new respect for what Vietnam veterans endured, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Share this with anyone who needs to understand that combat wasn't the only danger American soldiers faced in Southeast Asia. Thank you for watching.